we're seeing a partial screen at the moment, at least I am. And there we are. We're good. We've got the
Beautiful.
Super. Right, I'll hand over to you. Take it away, Nathan.
Give me just one more second. Let me arrange my goods and services so I can see and read everybody. Beautiful. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Is it all good? Lovely.
Got you.
Yeah, so Laura just shared the slides. So yeah, maybe first thing to do is to say thanks very much for sort of having me. It's really nice. It's also very nice that I'll get to treat myself to a beer later. I really enjoy and love the bars in Glasgow, but I kind of think maybe the beer is better here. So just shots fired right at the beginning. So since I'm going first, I thought I would kind of do a little bit of a warm-up and lean into, I think, a really nice, familiar lesson from someone who's not terribly far away from here, who was not terribly far away from here, and René Magritte in his Treachery of the Image, or Treachery of Images. So I really like the point that he's making here, which is, as I take it, like, look, if we're being really serious about this painting, right, it's not a pipe. Well, even in this case, it's even slightly weirder because it's not technically a painting, right? It's a digital image that you're all getting that's a representation of the painting, which is a representation of some object. And I think Magritte's right. But I think Magritte's point gets a little bit weirder or harder to parse once we start moving on to, instead of just flat surfaces or flat images, three-dimensional models. So three-dimensional models of pipes where we can maybe move around it and see its broad shape, and depending upon the kinds of ways we can engage with it, we maybe even could say smoke the pipe, right? And I think at that point, really, Magritte's point becomes a little bit harder to stomach. It seems like there's some substance to it, there's some depth to it, we can play around with it, we can interact with it. And so we might be tempted to say, no, this is some kind of pipe. I think that's wrong. And so basically what I want to try and do is talk a little bit about why I think that's wrong. So more particularly, what I want to do is start off by kind of mapping what I take to be not necessarily all, but most of the options with regards to the ontology of augmented objects. This is going to be really rough and ready, and will be kind of familiar territory, but I think it's helpful to go through it. I'll then turn to what I'll call augmented reality fictionalism. So this is very close to a view that Neil and I have developed in other work. I'm going to try and make a little bit of a case for it, but at least really kind of spell it out and tell you what it is. Then I want to talk about 4 objections to augmented reality fictionalism. One of them is a familiar one. It's something Neil and I have talked about. The other 3 aren't, or at least they've not been explicitly articulated as objections to fictionalism. I think David has come close in some ways, but I kind of want to talk about them explicitly as objections and spell out how I think the ARFer would respond. If there's enough time, I'll say a little bit about one particular weird case or an instance that I think is really hard to make sense of if you're a realist about augmented reality. We'll sort of see how that goes. And then we'll all wrap up and go home happy. So that's the plan. I should say anytime along the way, if you have questions or stuff, you can put it in the chat or put your hand up, or we can wait to the end. Whatever's kind of easier for people is fine with me. So that's the plan. Let's get started. The first thing to do is to kind of characterize augmented reality. We've been talking about this for quite a while already, so I'm not going to really bother too much with that. It's basically stuff like this. So this one should be kind of familiar to people, right? This is just Pokemon Go. The other one here is called Place by IKEA. It's a super cool app. I don't know if it's still available, but it's one where you could flip through a bunch of their catalog and then place it in a kind of virtual or augmented version of your room. So you get a sense of like how the armchair would fit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what I think is neat about AR is what you get is something like computer-generated elements or objects or entities somehow in physical space, out in the real world somehow. They're integrated with this, right? They don't quite pass the Q-tip test in that we can't kick them, but right, we can maybe engage with them in a certain kind of way so that if we kick where they look like they are, they'll seem to move and things like this. What I think is nice about AR is that it's not as immersive as VR, at least in one sense of immersive, in that it's not what's called perceptually immersive. So you're still kind of in the physical world, engaging with these objects. It's not kind of transporting you to some other environment or world or something like this. And then finally, and I think this is actually a kind of point we'll come back to, it's not isolating, or it tends to be shared, or at least more so than VR, at least used to be. I think VR is slowly moving towards it's being a shared experience. But more often, these kinds of things are ones where a bunch of different people can kind of triangulate on the same augmented reality object. Rough and ready, I hope that's pretty familiar. I think that fits broadly with how other people characterize this sort of stuff. So that's just how I'm going to run with it. So when it comes to thinking about augmented reality, a natural question, or at least if you're ontologically minded, is to ask, are AR objects real? You might also ask something about, like, do the events depicted in augmented reality really occur or really happen? I'm not going to really talk about the event stuff. I'm just going to focus on the objects. Now, this is a cool question. I think it's an important question, but there's a distinct question that sometimes gets conflated, which is that, are digital objects real? And now this is stealing something from David, right? Where digital objects are basically data structures of binary information. They're bits, right? They're maybe kind of electrical structures or things like this going on inside the processors, etc., of our various devices. Now, we might ask the question about the augmented reality objects. To go back a slide, that's asking particularly about, like, the Zubat here. Is it real? Right? Is the Pokemon itself real? And that's distinct from a question about, like, hey, are the underlying data structures going on inside the phone, are those real? Two different questions, right? And I think both of them we should probably say something about if we're interested in this debate. A quick side note, we might wonder, what the hell does it mean to say something is or isn't real? This is a fun, difficult question. Following David in the book, I think there's a couple different ways to cash these out. He talks about 5 different ways. We'll really just focus on 4. So we might say something's real if it exists. So non-real things don't exist. That's actually the way this event was formulated, right? It asks if augmented reality objects exist. You might also think things are real if they have causal powers, if they're mind independent, or, and this one's a little bit fuzzy, but I think it's reasonably clear, if they're sort of non-illusory, or they're really the way that they seem to be in some kind of way. We'll kind of run with all of these. I think the kind of most flat-footed one is the existence one. As I'm going to go on, the irrealist option I'm going to develop just says augmented reality objects don't exist at all. And hence the rest of these kind of just follow. But there's room for a little bit of maneuvering there if we want to. So again, kind of with regards to our 2 questions, there's 2 broad families of answers, right? There's realist ones which say, yes, these things are real. They exist, have causal powers, they're mind independent, etc., etc., etc. Or irrealists say, no, right? These things aren't real, don't exist, blah, blah, blah. Notably, there is kind of a weird sortivist position, which, as far as I know, no one's really played with much, at least not in this debate, but they have in other debates that are kind of similar, like with fictional objects or literary characters. And this we might think of as a kind of, yes, sortivist right? Thank you. The idea is here kind of following someone like Chris McDaniel. We might say, look, reality or being real comes in degrees. And physical stuff is like really real. It's got reality to a very high degree. Whereas these fictional characters and stuff like that, they're less real, maybe just a little. And we might have a similar kind of position with regards to augmented reality objects or digital objects. I'm not really going to talk about sortaism. I'll leave that for somebody else to figure out. As I see it with regards to the two questions, right? You have augmented reality realism and irrealism, and then digital object realism and irrealism. This gives us our lovely little matrix, right? The two yeses, a no and a yes and a no and a no, right? Fairly straightforward. I think that's fairly sensible. Right off the bat, though, I think we can knock out the bottom two. And put really bluntly, I think we can knock out the bottom two because I think digital object realism is just kind of silly. I think we can physically interact with a bunch of the digital objects, at least if we understand them as something like data structures, or especially if we think about them as electronic bits going through these little phones, right, or various machines. So I think our bottom pair are off the table. If there's people who really want to buy them, cool, I'm happy to give you space for it, but I think that just kind of puts them down. So we're ending up basically with these two options, right? You're going to take digital objects as given, they're real, and we're left wondering, okay, what do we say about the augmented objects themselves, right? Remember, that's talking about the Pokemon, not the underlying data structures, that those things exist. Right? So how might we be realists, right? Now, remember, the realist says, okay, the augmented and the digital objects both are real, they both exist, etc. I think the best way to approach this is to think about the kind of relationship here between the augmented objects and the digital objects, right? Between the Pokemon and the underlying data structure. A cheap way to think about it is, right, we might wonder, cool, what do these lines represent? What's the relationship being represented here, right? And as I see it, there's basically three options. There's a kind of reductionist option, there's a dependence option, and there's an autonomy option. So reduction just says, hey, the augmented reality objects just are the digital objects, right? There's a kind of identification or just flat reduction of the Pokemon to the data structure, right? The spoon to the code in the matrix, whatever exactly that is. And I think this is the view, and David can correct me on this, I think this is the view that David wants to hold, or something very close to what David wants to hold. He says things that I think are kind of along these lines. And I think notably, this view roughly parallels a very similar position, an old position in the mind-body debate, which is a kind of identity view, right? Or a reductionist physicalist view, where we just say, hey, the mind just is the brain or certain brain states or something like this. Cool. Another option is something like a dependence view. And the dependence view, right, says, hey, augmented reality objects exist, the digital objects exist, and the relationship here is one of something like ontological dependence, right? So exactly what relation ontological dependence is here, it's cool, right? Could be constitution, could be grounding, could be just good old metaphysical dependence, supervenience, whatever you like. What's important is there isn't an identity or a reduction. We have two different objects. And then finally, you have autonomy. And autonomy says, sorry, Ben, this isn't your kind of autonomy. You have, okay, cool, there's the augmented reality objects and the digital objects, and they're just different things. Maybe there's a causal relationship between these two, but causation is one thing, it's not dependence. Right? They're broadly, at least possibly, independent. Now, I think autonomy is a really, really, really weird view. I put it out here basically just for something like completion's sake. Yeah, reduction or dependent, good. Fair. So I think, now I'm gonna go fast and quick through these, but I think we should reject all three options. And now, of course, there's gonna be lots of variation and tweaking and moves to be made about how to get these going, but I think the basic problems are general enough that they'll apply across the board. So the first one with regards to autonomy is, this just seems weird. This just seems so silly as an option. I don't really see how it's viable. It seems to fly in the face of this tight connection between augmented reality objects and digital objects. David talking about this says, look, when I see a virtual sword, there's a causal pathway leading from the data structure to my eyes and brain. And there's a kind of counterfactual dependence here almost. Like if the virtual sword had been longer and sharper, the data structure would have been different. And I think that already tells us that the relationship needs to be something stronger than whatever autonomy is, this autonomy-esque view is going to characterize it as. It's a quick and dirty objection, but I think we can refine the objection to basically get rid of something like this view. I think a better option is a reductionist view, right? This is the identification view, right? Digital object just is, sorry, augmented object just is digital object. Problem is, I think this kind of runs into, well, what Neil and I have elsewhere called crossplay problems. In effect, this is something like a kind of multiple realizability problem, right? So the thought is, we might have cases where we have a single augmented reality object, but multiple distinct digital objects. And no, not distinct in the sense that like, oh, I'm looking through one phone and Neil's looking through a different phone, and hence we have an issue. The problems are more substantive than that. So the idea is something like, we might have different fundamental system structures. So maybe I have a 32-bit system, Neil has a 64-bit system. We're triangulating though on some one real single augmented reality object. We're both looking through our different systems of phones at, I think this is a Charizard, right? People can correct me if I'm getting the Pokemon wrong, right? So why is this a potential problem? Well, if Neil and I are both looking at the same augmented reality object, but we're doing it through two fundamentally different data structures, it seems very hard to explain how it is we're getting to just one AR object on reductionism. Because we should presumably have either two, because we've got different data structures, right? So there's actually just two kind of overlapping AR objects, or the identification here is one that forces us into kind of identifying it with a pretty gruesome disjunctive digital object. And I don't think either of those are very nice. So I think these sort of crossplay problems push us towards denying or rejecting reductionism. Again, fairly quick, happy to talk about this more, but I hope the basic problem there kind of comes through. So I think the best, most plausible version of realism is going to have to be something like a kind of dependence, right? The AR object exists, the digital object exists. They're not identical, but there's a kind of dependence relation between them. And I think this is, on the face of it, a pretty good view. I think it has two reasons that make me a little bit squeamish about it. One of them is it faces very familiar causal overdetermination objections. So I'm not going to go through this very quickly, but anyone who's interested, right, there's a lot of literature about causal exclusion problems. Basically, any time that stuff says mental, replace it with augmented, and we're good to go, right? So I think that's a case against this kind of dependence thing. It's going to proliferate overdetermination. I'm not sure that that's really that bad, but hey, some people think it is. A slightly more worrisome, or at least for some people more worrisome, view is that dependence is potentially ontologically profligate. That is, dependence, again, posits both kinds of objects and posits both kinds. So a thought is, cool, if we could get by with just the digital stuff, right, without having to posit the augmented stuff too, we'd have a nicer theory, or at least a more ontologically parsimonious theory, one that's nicer if you're inclined towards, in this case, it's virtual desert landscapes, but desert landscapes nonetheless. Now, again, I'm not terribly sure that this is, well, actually, let me rephrase that. I am terribly sure that this is not a knockdown argument by any stretch of the imagination. But I think this at least kind of pushes us a little bit towards thinking about our realist options. Right? So that's basically it for kind of mapping the initial terrain and mapping realism. So let's think about irrealism. So remember, what does the irrealist say, or at least as I understand the irrealist? They say digital objects exist, right? The data structures, the code stuff exists, but the augmented reality stuff doesn't. So the armchair here that the person's kind of moving around, they're in one, right? Instead, there's something like an underlying data structure that the person's manipulating via the touchscreen on their phone. Now, I think the biggest challenge for an irrealist view, and again, this is kind of nice because it's a very similar challenge for irrealists in other debates, like a realist about fictional characters, is how do we make sense of our talk? That is, how do we make sense of what seems to be pretty sensible, maybe even true, talk about augmented reality? Right? If we're manipulating this, we might want to say things like, hey, I moved the chair, or oh, the chair looks really good over here, right? Or to come to an example in David's book, right? Oh, the virtual piano sounds lovely, right? Now, one of the things we can do with these kinds of things is we just go full error theory, right? Cool, that stuff's just false, it's misleading, it's just wrong. You can maybe make this error theory a little bit nicer by saying, cool, what you really should have said was something like, you engaged with such and such a data structure in such and such a way. I think what's interesting is that the most flat-footed version of the error theory I can think of actually faces a version of the crossplay problem, where Neil and I might be using our different systems and we want to engage with something like the same augmented reality object, but we're playing with different data structures. So it's very hard then to see how this error theory would let us make sense of what we're doing there. I think more importantly, though, this kind of move is really hard to stomach, especially given the sort of proliferation that AR and VR talk is going to have, presumably, right? If the rising tides don't get us first, right? So error theory, not so good. Cool. Let's go with the better view. Let's go with the view that Neil and I basically came up with, which is that AR objects are fictional. Now, the first thing to note here is we got to figure out what the hell it means to say something is fictional. And I think one huge issue here is that lots of people, when they think of fictional, they immediately jump to something like narrative fiction, right? And that's a mistake. That's a misunderstanding of what it means to say things are fictional. The underpinning kind of story that I like, I'll leave Neil out of this because I'm about to get to some silliness. So the underlying story that I really like is broadly Waltonian. So the Walton story is that when we're engaged with representational works, be they artworks or be they not artworks, what we're doing is something like playing games of make-believe. So the idea here is that the kinds of, make-believe or imaginary games we might play as children, basically that's the same stuff we're doing when we say engage with maps, when we look at Magritte's The Treachery of Images, right? When we play video games, I think, when we engage with AR and VR. Now, what's important is when we're doing these games of make-believe, what we're meant to make believe isn't just kind of free-flowing or chaotic, it's constrained. And it's constrained by props and principles of generation. So props are objects whose existence and features can be used or are used to prescribe what to make believe. So a very silly little prop is Chip. I don't know if you guys can see Chip, right? Chip's a puppet. Chip is designed to look like a chipmunk. Chip's a very good prop, I think, in that, right, just simply his design and properties and things already kind of push you towards what you're supposed to make believe. He's got stripes, he doesn't have any teeth, he's not terribly mobile, he's a little bit chunky, etc., 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 right? The actual props of the object, or the properties of the object, are telling you what you're supposed to make believe. Right? Now, along with principles of generation, or sorry, along with props, we also have something like principles of generation. These are basically something like rules that fix prescriptions to make believe. Right? So rules might be, say, imagine wherever Chip is, that's where, sorry, wherever the puppet is, that's where Chip is located, etc., etc. You sort of see how this goes. Now, with props and principles of generation, we get this idea of what's called walled fictions. Walled fiction is a kind of work, an artifact. It doesn't even necessarily have to be an artifact. It can be real objects. It can be people, right? But it's an entity whose function is to serve as a prop in a game of make-believe. So my little puppet, that's a walled fiction. A map, according to Walton, is a walled fiction. An actor on the stage is a kind of walled fiction. So note here, what we've got is a massive broadening out of what it means to be a fiction. And it's not anything like a narrative, or anything like that. It's very, very broad. So, okay, there's the kind of background. So finally, to AR fictionalism. The idea is, again, augmented reality is or involves playing these kind of Waltonian games of make-believe. Right? The augmented reality objects don't exist. Pikachu sadly doesn't exist, right? What does exist are the underlying data structures, the digital objects, and these are the props. We're prescribed to use them to play games of make-believe. The principles of generation in play can either be explicit or implicit, depending on the given games that we're going to play. And finally, here's the really nice bit of the underlying story. We have a kind of talking as if account to make sense of AR talk. So we talk as if augmented objects exist, but this is really stuff that's kind of going on inside the game. So when I say something like, hey, Pikachu is standing under the lights, what's really going on is there's a kind of implicit, it's true in the game of make-believe that. Da, 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 right? Or if Neil and I are in some VR game and our avatars are talking to each other in a room, right? Well, I can say, hey, my avatar is in the room with Neil's avatar. Right? Strictly speaking, this isn't true. Right? What's really true is that there are various data structures giving me images that make me make believe or prescribe that I make believe that Neil and my avatars are in the same room. Now, here's what's kind of nice. Users and their actions can and will be props here. Right? So what I actually physically do can impact games of make-believe. For example, if we're playing some of the VR things, right? If I'm playing longbow, the way I move will impact what's going on in the game. Similarly, if I move my thumb in a certain kind of way, it'll throw out a Pokeball. Right? So again, real stuff can impact the games. Other nice kind of thing about it is some objects or things in the game really exist or really occur. So go again, take the case where Neil and I are virtually chatting. Well, here's what will be true. Neil and I talked. We really did chat, just like we might do using Zoom. In this case, we're using some VR program or AR program. You get the idea. Some things don't happen, right? Neil and I really weren't in the same room. Well, and I think what's nice is this story actually neatly fits and possibly even explains lots of people's natural reaction to discovering that something's merely an AR object. Right? It's that transition from them going, oh, I thought this was real, right, to, oh, no, it's just fiction. And I think this actually kind of lines up with a lot of the ways people talk. That's a weak point in our favor, but I think it's a nice point. So just to kind of add a few more points before we get to the objections, which I'm sure is the thing that everyone's actually interested in. I think one of the other really nice things about this view is that it treats AR on a spectrum with other tools or other kinds of work. So I don't think there's a really deep, dark, fundamental difference between AR, VR, and things like maps, simulators, video games, tabletop or live action role-playing games, things. I think these are all broadly in the same kind of spectrum. What's changing here is the particular tools involved. And that's important. And I think that's really the interesting and fundamental thing that we should be talking about in these things, how these tools impact. But I think it's, thank you. But I think in a lot of these cases, we're being sidelined by a kind of ontological inflation, possibly being misled by how easy it is to slide into in-game talk. What's really interesting are the types of tools involved, the fact that AR is particularly computer-based, or the sorts of props it engenders, not its somehow deep ontologically distinct nature. Here's another really cool thing. The fictionalist, we can tell the exact same story as the realist does. So as I understand it, Chalmers suggests that, right, VR and AR isn't illusory, provided we're sophisticated users. There's a particular kind of phenomenology of virtuality or augmented reality. And once we get involved in it, we're no longer seeing things illusory, right? Our virtual or augmented perceptions aren't illusions. We can say the same thing, right? Initial users mistakenly think augmented reality objects are real, that they exist, hence their perceptions are illusory. As they become more sophisticated, they come to realize or to know that AR objects don't exist. Instead, what they're really perceiving are props, these digital objects underpinning it. And as long as they're aware of this, then their perceptions need not be illusory. So it's kind of neat. I think we can steal a story with, names change to protect the innocent. And the final big kicker, it's less ontologically profligate, right? We only need the digital objects. We don't need the augmented objects. Cool. Okay. How am I doing for time? Yeah, I'll do my best. Okay, cool. So here comes the fun parts. Let's think about objections. The first objection is one that Neil and I have talked about. It looks like you can steal augmented objects, right? That's bad. If you can steal augmented objects, then it looks like they exist. Right? So how might we respond to this? Well, here's a quick and dirty response. It seems like you're stealing the augmented object, but in fact, what you're really doing is something like removing the underlying digital object, or probably better, more explicitly, you're preventing access to the relevant digital object. And I think if you're very careful here, you can make sense of a lot of the kind of talk and thought that people put in. So we can talk more about that if you like. Let's talk about the other three objections because they're more fun. Here's the next one. It looks like we can interact with augmented reality objects, or to put it more bluntly, AR objects look like they're real because they seem to have causal powers. And if they have these powers, then they've got to exist. So in the book, Chalmers talks about if I see a virtual gun, the gun may elicit a fight or flight response in me. Philip Bray says virtual objects aren't just fictional objects. They often have rich perceptual features, and more importantly, they're interactive. Right? David also talks about a minimum power, the power to be perceived. I won't really talk about the minimal power. I think that's problematic. But I think this objection's not a very potent one. So here's one reason. If we take it seriously, it looks like it's going to prove a hell of a lot of stuff exists or is real. Here are some interactable, terrifying objects. The alien from Alien Isolation. Pyramid Head, those of you who've played Silent Hill will know this, right? Pyramid Head is terrifying. Pyramid Head is interactable. Pyramid Head is not real. I hope to God he's not real. But it looks like we could run the same exact argument. It can initiate a kind of fight or flight. I really think it's strange to think that these happen. If you don't like those examples, we can even talk about, again, tabletop role-playing game examples too. Right. There's a weird issue here too about what objects we're picking out. We can talk about that in Q&A. Basically, I think what's going on is, again, a kind of fast and loose move. What's really going is that the props have causal powers, and we're reading it as, or we're treating it as if the augmented objects have these powers. And the fight or flight response can be explained in terms of immersiveness. And I have some other work where I try and cash out immersiveness in terms of the qualities of props or the ease of use with these relevant props. So again, nothing really problematic here. Here's another one, mind independence. So in the more recent book, Chalmers says augmented reality objects are real because they're mind independent, or at least they seem to be. And if they're mind independent, then it looks like they've got a leg up on being existent or being real. So Chalmers says, right, talking about a virtual piano in Washington Square Park, look, if everyone leaves, the virtual object's still there. And I think kind of extending it, if everyone went away, if there were no minds, the virtual piano would still be there. I find that very strange. I feel like there's a much better story to tell, which is that the AR object ceases to exist, but the underlying prop's still there. Here's a couple intuition pumps. If there were no minds at all, I think chip wouldn't exist. I think the prop would still be there, but the thing that is chip, whatever that exactly is, would just cease to be. Another case, I think if there were no minds, Tilburg University would cease to exist, despite the fact that all the files and buildings and everything like that would still be here. Finally, lastly, does anyone know what this is? So it's a bunch of bits from the game Senate. Here's something really cool. I think all the parts are there. Whatever they're supposed to be in the game, they're gone. Nobody knows what they're supposed to do anymore. What is this in the game? Oh no, nobody knows. We've lost the rules. I think the best story to tell with Senate is the props are all there. The game objects are gone. I would feel like the same thing should be said with regards to the augmented reality objects. The AR objects are gone. The digital structures are there. Last one, I promise. This one I think is actually maybe the most fun. So one of the things Neil always tells me is that AR is going to be super duper pervasive. It's going to be kind of everywhere in the near future. And here's a thought. If AR becomes so pervasive that it's everywhere, it's impossible to kind of get around in the world without engaging with it. It looks like augmented reality objects are going to be pervasive. And when it becomes so pervasive, then fictionalism looks weird. It looks really hard to maintain. So here's a thought, a fictionalist defense in this kind of AR is everywhere and it's always on and we can't get away from it. I think there's something like this that happens a lot with games of make-believe. I think they start to ossify. We start out with certain, maybe explicit, maybe implicit games that we're playing. And over time, because of their nature or because of their pervasiveness or whatever, they become all-encompassing or just so second nature to the players that they stop being aware that they're actually playing a game of make-believe. And at that point, I don't think it's right to say it's not a game of make-believe. I just think that what they're doing is maybe they've slid back into something like the mistake that the non-sophisticated user has. Right? Or maybe they really need to kind of rethink what the underpinnings of these institutions, etc., are. I think something like this might happen with institutional talk. I mentioned universities, right? I think maybe this is one of the reasons why we think those are real. There's an interesting case to be made about fiat currency here, but this is something that I'll push you to Neil if you want to have an argument about. But I think this is maybe one of the most interesting objections to the kind of fictionalism. So cool. I'll skip the weird case. We can talk about it if people want. And let's just wrap up. So I think there's a number of options when it comes to the ontology of AR objects. And I think that when we think about the realist forms, none of them are, at least to my mind, terribly attractive. Again, I didn't really offer what I took to be knockdown arguments, but raise problems. Instead, I think that fictionalism offers a kind of nice, sensible approach. I think it can handle the 4 objections that I've thrown at it to varying degrees. So in the end, the take-home message is, hey, AR fictionalism is the way to go. So thank you guys very much. And let me just recommend something. If you're really interested in these debates, my friends Nila van der Mosselaar and Stefan Guleni have a very cool video game called The Doors In that is explicitly about fictionalism about video game objects. And it pushes you to think about what exactly you are committed to and how to understand these things. I very, very, very much suggest going to play it. I think it has a nice kind of impact on some of these debates too. So thanks, guys.
Thank you, Nathan. I saw a slightly startling brief flash of my own image as you skipped past the weird case, so I'm not going to ask about that. I think it's something to do with being a frog, and I really didn't want to go there. The standard thing for us to do here is to get questions from everyone by sending me a queue as a private message, and I'll put you on the list for questions. So if you can just do that just now in the chat, that would be cool. Normally I would wade in now with a question of my own, but since we are singing so much from the same hymn sheet, that probably wouldn't work so well. Right, we'll go with David first. I know you need to go fairly soon, David, so you take us away.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, Nathan, for a super interesting talk. And by the way, I apologize. I have to leave after this talk for an unmissable meeting. I'm hoping it might end before the end, in which case I'll show up towards the end. But, yeah, this is really interesting. I'm interested in the relationship between AR fictionalism and VR fictionalism on your view. I mean, your arguments against VR realism are fairly close to yours and Neil's arguments against VR realism. So I'm wondering whether, I mean, I said a few things about that in our exchange in Disputatio, but I'm wondering whether you think they stand and fall together, basically, or whether there's distinct issues that come up for AR. And one thing that occurs to me is that actually there's something which is slightly more plausible about fictionalism in the AR case than in the VR case, which is there does seem to be this kind of manifest, arguably a fiction, that all this is taking place in the physical world, in physical space, which isn't the case for which isn't the case for virtual reality. Arguably, in the virtual space. In augmented reality, it all does seem to be happening in a physical space. So that kind of opens up, at least for me, the possibility of an intermediate view, which is that, well, the objects are real, as in VR, that there's a fiction, I mean, and they're digital objects, but there's a fiction that all these objects are inhabiting physical space. That would be kind of an intermediate view. I guess on the metaphysics, the way I'm understanding that view, it would still be realist about the object, but still fictionalist about the content. I guess it's a bit like a, that would be a view where it's like a fiction that involves real people, you know, which I guess happens. People writing fictions about, you know, or whoever. So I don't know. What do you think? I'm curious to get your take on this.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. I like that. I think that there's a kind of similar issue. One version of this that I played around with thinking about was where we might have an augmented reality object and a physical object seemingly occupying the same space. and how that might raise a bunch of problems, maybe even some, it's a physical impossibility, say, depending on the kind of augmented reality object that it's supposedly. Yeah, I think that might be a neat push towards some kind of physicalism. Or, sorry, fictionalism, Jesus. The weird thing I think about the hybrid position you were pitching is that I think that's really going to depend on what sort of other properties you think the AR object has. Because it looks like it's not going to have anything like, its spatial location is going to be strange, right? You'll have to have some kind of story about the talk of like, oh, the Pikachu's under the tree. Well, no, it's not, it's in your hand. Or something like this. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking that the various spatial properties will be, all those will be fictional content, but the digital object doesn't really have those properties.
Yeah, I mean, Neil mentions a shadow. I guess the reason why I'm kind of thinking there might be a lurking problem here would be, again, with some kind of like triangulation. So if we think that, you, Neil, and I are looking at the same augmented object, I find that really hard how we would make sense of in this kind of funny way. But that's super off the cuff and something I think that would need a bunch of more thought to really suss out.
That parallels an issue that comes up with VR, right? So to that extent, those two, the metaphysics of the objects, I think, is actually on a par in the two cases, VR and AR.
I mean, I kind of think it's better just to go like
I agree.
the same across the board, but yeah, I don't know.
I say yes for what it's worth. They're on a par in for this part of the authorship of the previous views. It's weird, the caveats we now need to put it. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Thanks for that. Can I go to Adrian?
Thanks a lot. That was really, really interesting. So I wanted to ask a question about the idea that digital objects exist, and what we mean when we say that digital objects exist, or what specifically you mean. So I presume it's not simply that there's some hardware that we're interacting with, right? That presumably you mean something else than the hardware, perhaps something that the hardware produces, something realized by the hardware. Sometimes data structures or code streams are mentioned. But data structures aren't objects in any ordinary sense of the term. So maybe there's a special sense of the term object that we're using here. But I actually wonder really whether you need to engage with this idea at all, why you need the notion of a digital object. It seems like all you need is a prop, right? That there's something that functions as a prop. And you don't need this additional bit of stuff, a digital object that serves some role in bringing about the prop. So it seems like this is a potentially problematic way of thinking, that there are these things, digital objects, when we have these other ways of thinking about what's involved, data structures. We don't necessarily need to think of those as objects. Hardware, well, those are objects, but they're not digital objects, physical objects. And we have props, right? Why do we need digital objects? And if we do, then what are they?
Yeah, cool. To be honest, I almost entirely agree with you. And I think you're totally right in that whatever the hell digital objects are, they are going to be kind of weird, structure-y, probably kind of hieromorphic objects. I'm not exactly sure. Here's the cheap answer, which I think is actually the right one. I'm using digital object in the same way that I take my opponents in these debates to be. And if it turns out that we can kind of they're not objects per se, they're kind of data structures, etc. Cool. Then just copy replace what I was saying with a digital object with that stuff. And that's really what I meant with the term digital object there. And I think basically everything I said about how the irrealist about these things, once we properly construe them, again, cashing it out however you like, that just looks really bad. And that looks implausible once we're serious about what exactly these digital objects are. That's the rough and ready answer. But you're totally right in that to make the fictionalist stuff go, all we need is props. I think these are the really nice ready-to-hand ones. Or perhaps better, the term digital object is a nice ready-to-hand term to pick out whatever the hell the underlying things are supposed to be. I think one interesting thing that's kind of related to what you mentioned is I think hardware has to get involved in this somehow too, when we're characterizing this stuff. So David talks about the digital objects being kind of grounded in computational processes going on in the hardware. I think maybe we need to get a little, it's stronger than just that because of glitches. So this is something my friend Nayla and I have talked about with regards to video games and how sometimes it looks like glitches can actually generate world content, in-world content, independent of whatever the code is supposed to be doing. And I haven't seen any VR, AR cases like that, though I yield to the other experts on this. But I wonder if maybe those kinds of, like there could be generative glitches in the AR, VR cases that would basically push us to do something kind of similar here. So yeah, I hope that kind of addresses your worry.
Yeah, that was great, thanks.
Super, and one quick brief question, hopefully from Fiona to finish off, please.
Thanks, Neil. Hi, Nathan. I enjoyed that very much. So I know you skipped over a slide at the end, which was about, it would seem that if Neo can be a frog in AR, but, essentially Neo can't be a frog, therefore, there's not really this frog. I was actually, in thinking through things, I was thinking about cases where, one thing that doesn't seem really true in a game is if you have a certain avatar, like, we often say, oh, that's me dead now, I've been killed. And obviously you haven't been killed. And it seems to me that this is a kind of, if we're starting to say, well, AR objects, well, look, they're not really in space, they're not really frogs, they're not really alive, they can't really be killed. We're starting to have this list of properties where we're starting to undermine whether the object really is the kind of object that it seems to be, right? So if it seems to be a frog, but yet it's not alive and it can't be killed and it's not in space and so on, then you're undermining the thought that it's the kind of object that it seems to be. And that ties back to one of the criteria that you listed at the start for things being real, that they're non-illusory and they are as they seem to be. So on sort of two grounds, the realist ground that it's non-illusory and the sort of metaphysical ground that it's certainly not the sort of object that we would normally claim it to be, a frog, then it seems like these are really quite powerful and worrying objections for the realist.
So yeah, amen. Yeah, I think that those are big issues there. Yeah, and this was, so I included this partially just because I wanted to poke at Neil, who's an old and about to be even older man. But yeah, I think once we start, so to kind of tie it back to some of the earlier work from David, who's now gone, so we can really lay into him, right? So he has these moves about, oh, it's not a kitten, it's a virtual kitten, these kinds of things. I worry a lot about the kinds of properties these objects will purportedly have, and in what sense can they even be taken to be anything like the things that they're supposedly instances of. And yeah, I take your objection to be a much better phrased version of something like that. So yeah, I think that's a big issue lurking here for would-be realists.
Yeah, so I think you could make that, in other words, I think you could make this a slightly less weird case and build it into the stuff that you're already doing.
Yeah, I think I see this as an avatar case updated. So we had the avatar problem that we raised before, and Dave answered to in some way in his response piece to us, I think, or even in the original paper at a later draft. But this is supposed to make it harder by making it a case of a metaphysically impossible thing, rather than just that you don't have those properties. It's like it's metaphysically impossible that you would have those properties. So it's supposed to be like a super avatar case, an avatar case plus, as I see it. That's my reading anyway. I should stop there, actually. We are running just slightly over time, so I'm going to say let's be back at 8 minutes past for Adrian's. We'll make up a wee bit of time here. So we'll take a break now, back at 8 minutes past. Thanks very much, Nathan, again.